You know, the fall of Rome wasn't some single dramatic event. It was more like a long, slow disease. And sometimes, the most revealing moments are actually the shortest. Today, we're going to look at a period of just 13 years, and then 86 days. That's it. But in that tiny window, we see the story of two emperors, back to back. One, a total tyrant, and the other, a dedicated reformer. And what happened to them shows just how deep the rot had set in, long before the whole thing came crashing down.
So our story really kicks off with a kind of paradox. It starts with one of Rome's greatest emperors, the philosopher king, Marcus Aurelius. But according to the historian Edward Gibbon, his best quality, his goodness, his mildness of heart, was also his single greatest flaw. Why? Because he was a fantastic ruler of an empire, but maybe not such a great judge of his own son. And that blind spot, that fatherly love, was about to unleash a total disaster on Rome.
All right, Section 1, a father's fatal flaw. So when Marcus Aurelius dies, his son, a 19-year-old kid named Commodus, inherits the world. Really. His father had already made him co-emperor, giving him full power, despite the fact that all the best tutors in the world couldn't seem to make a dent in him. But, the empire itself was peaceful, it was prosperous. Commodus had no rivals to fear, no enemies to crush. And for the first few years, things were fine. He just let his dad's old, wise advisors run the show while he just enjoyed being the emperor.
Okay, so Section 2, the emperor's new paranoia. Because that initial calm, it was about to be absolutely shattered. A single, terrifying moment was going to transform this spoiled, lazy prince into a full-blown, paranoid tyrant.
Picture this. Commodus is walking through a dark, narrow passage in the city. Suddenly, an assassin leaps out, sword drawn, and shouts these exact words. Now, the guards grab the guy before he can even land a blow, but the damage was done. Not by the sword, but by the words. The Senate sent you this. That phrase just burned itself into the emperor's brain, planting this seed of absolute fear and hatred that would poison everything.
And here's the real tragedy. The Senate? They had absolutely nothing to do with it. The plot was actually cooked up by his own sister. But that didn't matter. Commodus only heard those 5 words. And from that point on, his fear was the law. His trusted advisors suddenly looked like enemies. A simple suspicion was all it took to be considered guilty, and a trial? Well, a trial became just a formality before a guaranteed death sentence.
Which brings us to Section 3, the gladiator on the throne. As this paranoia just spiraled out of control, Commodus completely checked out of his duties. He abandoned the state and retreated into the one place that made sense to him, the blood and sand of the arena.
You can literally watch his downfall in 4 clear steps. First, he hands over all the real power to these corrupt ministers who just tell him what he wants to hear. Then, he completely ignores his job, disappearing into this private world of pleasure with a harem of, 300 women. That leads directly to step 3, his obsession with performing in the amphitheater himself, which all culminates in the ultimate delusion. He declares himself the living embodiment of Hercules, the Roman Hercules.
And the details here, they are just staggering. He fought in public as a gladiator 735 times. You have to understand, for a Roman, especially an emperor, this was the ultimate shame. It was a profession for slaves and criminals. He even demanded a huge salary from the state's gladiator fund, basically taxing his own empire to pay for his hobby. And then he forced the very men he feared, the Senate, to sit in the stands and applaud his infamy as he slaughtered hundreds of exotic animals for fun.
All right, Section 4, Death of a Tyrant. After 13 long years of this, the emperor's cruelty finally became a threat to absolutely everyone, especially the people who were closest to him.
I mean, it's the classic tyrant's end, right? The 3 people with the most access to him, his favorite mistress, his head of household, and the commander of his personal bodyguards, they all knew his paranoia was a ticking clock. Eventually, it would turn on them. So to save their own lives, they struck first. His concubine slipped poison into his wine, and when that didn't work fast enough, they sent in a professional wrestler to strangle him. And just like that, the son of Marcus Aurelius was gone.
So, on to Section 5, an empire beyond saving. With Commodus dead, the conspirators chose a successor who was his polar opposite, an old, respected senator named Pertinax. For a moment, it must have felt like a new dawn for Rome, a real moment of hope. But the question was the empire even capable of being saved anymore?
And the contrast between these two men, wow, it could not be more dramatic. Pertinax was actually an old friend of Marcus Aurelius, a guy who had risen up purely on merit and hard work. Where Commodus was all about extravagance and cruelty, Pertinax was about frugality and justice. He was, in every single way, the perfect antidote to the poison that had been running Rome for over a decade.
And Pertinax, he did not waste a single second. He immediately slashed the palace budget in half. He canceled all of Commodus's ridiculous taxes. He started giving fortunes back to the families who'd been robbed. And to refill the state treasury, which was basically empty, he held a giant auction, selling off all of Commodus's decadent junk, from his silk robes to his slaves.
86. That's how many days this incredible reform was allowed to last. Just 86 days. That was the entire lifespan of Rome's last best hope for a real course correction.
It's just heartbreaking how fast it all falls apart. On day 1, the city celebrates him. By day 3, a conspiracy is already brewing inside the Praetorian Guard, his own protectors. They missed their lazy, indulgent master Commodus, and they hated that Pertinax was trying to bring back discipline. And on day 86, they'd had enough. They marched on the palace and murdered the best man to rule Rome in years.
So why? Why did it end like this? Gibbon, again, just nails it. He says Pertinax's honest indiscretion was his undoing. Basically, his virtue was his downfall. He made the fatal mistake of trying to fix a system that had grown fat and happy on corruption. The soldiers, the palace staff, all the people who got rich and lazy under Commodus's chaos, they couldn't stand the fairness and justice Pertinax demanded. They preferred a tyrant who favored them over a reformer who treated everyone equally.
So here's where we're left. The reign of Commodus proved without a doubt how much damage one terrible leader can do. But the 86-day reign of Pertinax, that leaves us with a much more chilling question. Did his murder prove that the empire was already too far gone? That the system had become so dependent on corruption that it would violently, automatically reject any attempt at a cure? What does it say about a society when it can no longer tolerate a good man at the top?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most frankly unbelievable moments in all of Roman history. The day the world's greatest empire was literally, and I mean literally, put on the auction block.
You're looking at a quote from the great historian Edward Gibbon, and he really captures the sheer insanity of it all. This wasn't some kind of metaphor, you know? It was a real sale, a cash transaction that showed just how sick the Roman state had become.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The date is March 28, 193 AD. The emperor, a guy named Pertinax, has just been murdered. And who did it? His own bodyguards, the elite Praetorian Guard. But instead of, picking a new emperor, they do something that nobody could have predicted. They decide to sell the throne.
What happened next was just this surreal, frankly disgusting bidding war. So on the inside, you've got Sulpicianus, who's actually the dead emperor's father-in-law, trying to buy the empire from his son-in-law's killers. But then an outsider shows up. A fabulously rich senator named Didius Julianus literally runs over from a dinner party and starts shouting his bids up over the walls from the street.
And Julianus wins. He wins by offering a staggering 6,250 drachms to every single soldier. To put that in perspective, that's an enormous fortune. We're talking years of pay in one lump sum. And just like that, for a pile of cash, the Roman Empire was his.
So, the deal is done. The Praetorians, these guys who now both serve and totally despise him, form a phalanx around him and march him into the Senate. Can you just imagine that scene? The streets of Rome are empty, and the senators are forced to stand there and congratulate a man who just bought their world.
But that feeling of victory, it didn't last long. Once all the fake congratulations were over, Julianus was left all alone in this massive palace, and the reality of what he'd done just crashes down on him. He didn't win the empire. He didn't conquer it. He bought it. The buyer's remorse must have been absolutely terrifying.
As you can imagine, his reign was a total flash in the pan. The news of the auction spread like wildfire, and the powerful professional armies on the frontiers were disgusted. So within just 2 months, the very same guards who sold him the empire just abandoned him. He ended up being condemned by the Senate and was beheaded in a palace bath. His entire reign lasted a pathetic 66 days.
So this all brings up a pretty big question, right? How on earth did we get here? How does a unit of personal bodyguards become so powerful, so arrogant, that they think they can auction off the entire Roman world?
Well, it all goes back to these guys, the Praetorian Guard. They were actually created by the very first emperor, Augustus, to be his personal protectors. They were the cream of the crop, given double pay, special privileges, all to make sure they were absolutely, unshakably loyal to the emperor.
But that special status, it ended up being the seed of their own corruption. It started with privilege, sure, but the real turning point was when the Emperor Tiberius gave them their own permanent fortress, right inside Rome itself. Being that close to power taught them a really dangerous lesson. They held the keys to the kingdom. They saw the emperor's weaknesses up close, and they realized just how strong they were. And slowly, over time, the protectors turned into kingmakers.
So, back in Rome, you have this shameful auction. But out on the frontiers, the professional armies defending the empire, they saw this as an intolerable insult. So almost immediately, 3 incredibly powerful generals declared they were going to avenge the murdered emperor and, of course, claim the throne for themselves.
And just like that, the stage was set for a massive civil war. Out in the east, you had the popular Pescennius Niger. Over in Britain, the noble but kind of indecisive Clodius Albinus. And then on the Danube frontier, you had the ambitious and completely ruthless Septimius Severus. And of the 3, Severus had one critical advantage. He was the closest.
Severus knew that in this game, speed was everything. His legions in Pannonia were hardened, they were disciplined, and most importantly, they could get to Italy fast. So he marched them relentlessly towards Rome, sharing their hardships, sleeping on the ground, eating the same food. He led from the front, and his men absolutely loved him for it.
Now, the Praetorians back in Rome, they were soft. They were used to city life, so the very idea of facing Severus's battle-tested legions was terrifying. They completely folded, abandoned Julianus to his fate, and Severus basically took Rome without a fight. But you know, taking the city was the easy part. Holding the whole empire, that was going to be a lot harder.
Okay, so Severus has Rome, but he still has to deal with his 2 remaining rivals, Niger and Albinus. And this is where we see his true character. He was a master of political warfare, and his favorite weapon was pure deception. His strategy was just brilliant, in a terrifying way. He needed to keep Albinus busy in Britain while he went off to fight Niger in Syria. So what does he do? He offers Albinus the title of Caesar, basically making him deputy emperor. He flatters him, calls him his brother, all to lull him into this false sense of security while he was already planning to destroy him later. And if you want to know just how deep his deception went, get this. The very men who carried that friendly letter to Albinus were actually assassins. They had secret orders to kill him if they got the chance. The plot didn't work, but it tells you everything you need to know about this man. He would stop at absolutely nothing to win.
So after crushing both his rivals in a couple of brutal civil wars, Severus became the undisputed master of the Roman world. He ruled with an iron fist, but the very changes he made to keep himself in power, well, they ended up sowing the seeds of the empire's long, slow decline.
And this is what's so fascinating about his reign. On the one hand, he was actually a pretty good administrator. He brought order back after years of chaos, and the empire was peaceful and prosperous. But under the surface, a kind of poison was spreading. He had won the empire with his army, and he was going to govern through his army. See, Severus owed everything to his soldiers, and he paid that debt by just shattering tradition. He jacked up their pay, showered them with bonuses, and let them have comforts they'd never had before, like wearing gold rings or living with their families. But all these perks created a new, much bigger danger. An army that felt entitled, got comfortable, and was very, very aware that it was the true master of the state. And this, right here, is the heart of the matter. In his effort to fix the problem of a disloyal Praetorian Guard, Severus created a far worse one.
He essentially turned the government into a pure military dictatorship. This set a disastrous precedent, one that led straight into a century of chaos where emperors would rise and fall based on nothing more than the whims of the legions.
So the story that started with that insane auction ends with this legacy. And it leaves us with the question that's haunted nations for centuries, and still does today. What happens when the guardians of a state become its owners? Well, the Roman answer was pretty clear: decline, chaos, and eventually, the fall.
Welcome to The Explainer. We're about to dive into this absolutely pivotal moment in Roman history. It's a wild story of ambition, murder, and a fatal flaw that really sent the world's greatest empire spiraling. And it all kicks off with one man's final, kind of sad realization about what power is really worth. So get this. These are the final words of Emperor Septimius Severus. This guy spent his entire life clawing his way up from, basically nowhere to sit on the throne of the Roman world. And what did he find at the end of it all? Emptiness. His one last wish was just that the dynasty he fought so hard to build would actually survive him through his sons. Yeah, about that wish. It was pretty much doomed from the start. And the problem wasn't, some invading army or a failing economy. Nope. The poison was right there, inside his own family. A really deep, ugly hatred between his two sons, his heirs. Okay, so you had Caracalla and Geta, and man, they were total opposites. The historian Gibbon put it perfectly. He called it a fixed and implacable antipathy. I mean, that's some serious hate. Caracalla, the elder, was all about force, like, I'm the firstborn, I deserve this. Meanwhile, Geta, the younger brother, he was trying to win over the people. And this wasn't your average sibling rivalry. No way. This feud literally split the entire Roman world in two. So once their dad was gone, this feud just exploded. I mean, these two brothers couldn't even share a meal because they were terrified of being poisoned by the other. It got so bad, they actually thought about just splitting the entire empire in half. But Caracalla, he had let's just say, a darker and way more permanent solution in mind. Their mom, the Empress Julia, was just desperate to stop the fighting. So she sets up this peace meeting in her own private apartment, thinking this sacred family space would keep them both safe. Caracalla plays along, he agrees to it, all while luring his brother, who had no idea, right into a perfectly laid trap. Right in the middle of their talk, boom. Assassins loyal to Caracalla rush out from where they were hiding. Geta runs to his mom, trying to find safety, but it was no use. He was stabbed to death right there in her arms. She was wounded trying to save him, just covered in her own son's blood. Just horrible. And what Caracalla does next tells you everything. Everything. He doesn't go to the Senate to try and explain himself. He doesn't go to the Roman people. Nope. He runs. He runs straight to the camp of the Praetorian Guard, the empire's elite soldiers, and he opens up his father's treasury and just buys their loyalty. And that, right there, becomes his new, frankly terrifying policy for ruling. It's simple. Keep the army happy. Pay them, give them whatever they want. And everyone else, the Senate, the regular folks, the provinces, they don't matter. This was a huge shift. Military loyalty was now the only thing that mattered. So by making the army the one and only judge of who gets to be emperor, Caracalla basically kicks off an age of assassins. It just starts this brutal cycle. He gets murdered, his successor, Macrinus, gets murdered, and his successor, Elagabalus, gets murdered, all by their own soldiers. The throne was now officially for sale to whoever was the best killer. Okay, so the chaos after Caracalla's murder, it leads to one of the weirdest chapters in all of Roman history. Seriously. The power vacuum isn't filled by some respected general or a senator. No, it's filled by a teenage high priest from Syria. So after Caracalla is killed, the new guy, Macrinus, he tries to do something sensible. He tries to cut the army's crazy high pay back to what it was under Severus. But it's way too late for that. The army was spoiled. They didn't see it as a sensible budget cut. They saw it as an attack on them. Their loyalty, as we said, was up for grabs. And this is where the powerful women of the Severan dynasty see their chance. The old empress's sister and her daughters, they push a new guy forward. They claim that their grandson, this charismatic high priest of the sun god Elagabalus, is secretly Caracalla's illegitimate son. Now, this was a total lie, but hey, the disloyal troops, they were more than happy to buy it. So before this new emperor even gets to Rome, he sends a portrait of himself ahead to be hung up in the Senate. And you can just imagine the senators, right? These stoic Roman leaders staring at this painting of a figure in silk robes with painted cheeks and, yes, blackened eyebrows. They knew right then and there that Rome was now bowing to something completely different. Well, surprise, surprise, Elagabalus's reign was just this total whirlwind of religious extremism and scandal. So naturally, he also gets murdered by the Praetorian Guard. At this point, everyone is desperate for some stability. So the army and the Senate, they turn to his young cousin, Alexander Severus, who is known for being, well, a good guy. And Alexander was a completely different story. A stark contrast. He was the model emperor. You know, dutiful, smart, modest. You look at his daily routine, devotion, public affairs, studying Plato, simple meals. This guy was all about responsible government. He seemed like the perfect fix for all the chaos. But here's the thing. Being a good guy just wasn't enough anymore. Alexander's top advisor, a wise man named Ulpian, tried to bring some discipline back to the Praetorian Guard. And they were not having it. They mutinied, chased him through the palace, and murdered him, literally at the emperor's feet, while Alexander was begging them to stop. And Alexander was completely powerless. He couldn't punish the killers. He had to just pretend it didn't happen. This one moment shows with terrifying clarity that the emperor was no longer in charge of Rome. The whole system was just fundamentally broken. So this whole story, it's about more than just a couple of bad emperors, right? So what was really driving this decline? Why couldn't even a good emperor, like Alexander, stop this downward spiral? Well, the empire was trapped. It was caught in this vicious cycle, this doom loop. You have tyrannical emperors who bribe the army to stay in power. This creates a spoiled army that demands more and more. That, in turn, bankrupts the treasury, which forces the government to impose crushing taxes on everyone. And it leaves the government totally powerless, a hostage to its own soldiers. And a perfect example of this is the famous Edict of Caracalla. Now, on the surface, this looks great, right? He granted Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire. What a noble act. Except it wasn't. The real motive was pure greed. See, only citizens paid certain inheritance taxes. So by making everyone a citizen, Caracalla massively increased the number of people he could tax to pay for all the army's bonuses. And the amount of money we're talking about here is just staggering. Just a province of Asia, one province, was sending the equivalent of about £4.5 million sterling to Rome every single year. And a huge chunk of that was going directly to the military. Caracalla wasn't subtle about this either. He doubled the inheritance tax. Doubled it from 5% to 10%. He was literally crushing the empire under the weight of his taxes, all to fund the very army that was keeping his own tyranny afloat. And this is the real takeaway. The Roman army, the very institution that had built the empire, that had protected it for centuries, had become its own worst enemy, its greatest internal threat. The discipline was gone, replaced by pure greed. It had turned into a monster that not even a good emperor could control anymore. And this left Rome in an impossible situation, facing a paradox that honestly still echoes today. When the very guardians of an empire become its greatest threat, how can that decline possibly be stopped? Is there any way out? All right, today we're jumping straight into one of the most absolutely chaotic periods in all of Roman history. Seriously, it's a wild story of ambition, murder, and total systemic collapse. And it all boils down to a single fatal flaw in how the Roman Empire chose its leader. And this whole story, it really kicks off with a pretty cutting observation. The great historian Edward Gibbon starts with this zinger. I mean, think about it. He's asking, isn't it completely ridiculous that we hand over an entire nation to a king's baby son like it's a herd of cattle? That powerful warriors and wise politicians have to bow down to an infant in a cradle? It sounds insane, right? And yet, Here's the twist. Gibbon says, for all that absurdity, rule by bloodline has one massive advantage. He argues that Rome's alternative, this system that was supposedly based on merit, well, it created a power vacuum so destructive it just about tore the empire to pieces. And that paradox, that's right at the heart of our explainer.
So what was this fatal flaw? For Gibbon, it all came down to one thing: the crisis of succession. You see, in Rome, there just was no clear automatic line to the throne.
Here's how Gibbon lays it out. On one side, you've got hereditary rule. He calls it a useful prejudice. Yeah, it's illogical, but it prevents fighting, because everybody knows who's next. But the Roman way? It was a total free-for-all. The throne wasn't inherited, it was seized. The path to power didn't run through the family tree. It ran straight through the military barracks. And that meant every single ambitious general could look at the throne and see a prize just waiting to be won. This kind of system creates the absolute perfect conditions for what historians call military anarchy. You know, it's that terrifying moment when the army suddenly realizes it's the only real power in the state. Law, justice, the Senate, none of that stuff matters anymore. The only question is, who can we pay the soldiers to support? And one man was about to give a truly terrifying answer to that question. And listen, no one embodied this new reality better than a man named Maximinus Thrax, who burst onto the scene in the year 235.
Maximinus was the ultimate soldier's soldier. Gibbon describes him as a barbarian of gigantic stature, a guy so strong he supposedly took on 16 men in a row in a wrestling match. He started out as a peasant recruit, and just through sheer brute force and skill on the battlefield, he climbed all the way to the top of the army. His troops, they worshipped him. They called him Ajax and Hercules, but he knew absolutely nothing about law, about governing, or about the city of Rome itself. He was pure military force.
So the army just decided it wanted a change. They thought the emperor at the time, Alexander Severus, was weak, a mama's boy controlled by the Senate. So they did what armies do in a state of military anarchy. They just ignored the government, declared their general, Maximinus, the new emperor, and then murdered the old one in his tent. And just like that, power was transferred by the sword.
But here's the thing about an emperor created by violence. They usually rule by violence. And Maximinus's reign very quickly turned into a brutal tyranny, one that would end up uniting the entire empire against him.
Now, according to Gibbon, the source of this cruelty wasn't arrogance. It was a deep, deep insecurity. You see, unlike tyrants who were born to power, Maximinus was terrified that the Roman elite would look down on him, for his mean and barbarian origin. He lashed out first to stop them from ever showing that contempt.
And this insecurity, it just fueled his paranoia. He started executing anyone who knew about his humble beginnings, even people who had helped him climb the ladder. He never once dared to set foot in Rome, choosing to rule from his military camp way out on the frontier. And to keep his army happy, he needed money, lots of it. So he started seizing public funds, even looting the temples. And it was that final act of greed, way down in the province of Africa, that finally lit the fuse of rebellion.
This rebellion against Maximinus, it didn't just challenge his rule. Oh no, it kicked off a catastrophic chain reaction that would become the unbelievable, mind-bending chaos of the year AD 238.
That's right, 6 different men were proclaimed emperor in a single year. This wasn't just a political crisis, this was a complete and total meltdown of the entire system.
Okay, let's just try to follow this whirlwind. It starts in January. Rebels in Africa put up 2 new emperors, Gordian I and his son. By April, they're both dead. So the Senate in Rome hits back, electing 2 of its own guys, Maximin and Albinus. Later that same month, Maximinus, the original tyrant, he gets murdered by his own fed-up soldiers. Great, right? Nope, because in July, the Senate's 2 emperors are murdered by their own guards in Rome, which leaves only one guy left, the 13-year-old grandson of the first rebel, Gordian III. It's just a dizzying, breathtaking spiral of violence. Now, let's just pause for a second. Let's focus on that little window in the middle, right after the tyrant Maximinus was dead,
because for a brief moment, the Senate actually thought it had won. It had its own emperors on the throne. But this victory, it was a complete illusion. I mean, just imagine the scene. The monster is dead. The Senate's hand-picked emperors, Maximus and Albinus, they ride into the Capitol as heroes. People are celebrating in the streets. It feels like freedom has been restored, like a new golden age is about to begin. But in a private moment, these two new emperors had this absolutely chilling exchange. The idealist, Albinus, he asks, what reward can we expect for delivering Rome from this monster? And he's hoping for the love of all mankind. But Maximus, the tough old general, he replies with this haunting dose of reality. Alas, I dread the hatred of the soldiers. He knew the real fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. And boy, was he right. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers right there in Rome, they were furious. An emperor chosen by the army had just been defeated, and now emperors chosen by the Senate were in charge. They were terrified the Senate would get some slow revenge on them, disguised as discipline. So they decided to reassert the fundamental rule of military anarchy. If you've got the weapons, you've got the power. Period. So while the whole city was distracted by public games, the Praetorians stormed the palace. They grabbed both emperors, stripped them naked, and dragged them through the streets of Rome before brutally murdering them. And just like that, the Senate's brief taste of victory was over. It lasted less than 100 days. The army had spoken again, this time in blood. So where did all this chaos leave Rome? Well, the violence finally ended, but the resolution was incredibly grim. This wasn't a victory for law and order. It was the final, undisputed victory of military rule. With the Senate's emperors dead, the Praetorians needed a new puppet. They found the grandson of the original rebels, a 13-year-old kid named Gordian III. They hoisted him on their shoulders, carried him to their camp, and declared him emperor. And why him? Well, a child emperor promised a long, long time where the soldiers could basically do whatever they wanted. The cycle was complete. Gibbon uses this moment to zoom out and show the bigger picture of Rome's decay. He contrasts the early republic, founded on the virtues of citizen soldiers, with this late empire, which was now just defined by oppression. The army of citizens had become an army of mercenaries, and the rulers, once they were Roman magistrates, were now, as Gibbon puts it, a Syrian, a Goth, or an Arab, chosen entirely by the whim of that army. Gibbon's final point is that to an outsider, the empire probably looked the same. It still had its legions, it still had a senate, it still had an emperor. But as he so beautifully puts it, the form was still there, but the animating spirit, the health and vigor, that was gone. It was just an empty shell. And so Gibbon's incredible account of Rome leaves us with this timeless and, frankly, pretty chilling question. His work is a powerful warning about what happens when the institutions of a great power are still standing, but the foundational virtues, that animating spirit, have vanished. How long can any nation survive with just the form of power, but none of the spirit? It's a question that echoes far, far beyond ancient Rome. Thanks for tuning into this explainer.